Norris was rushed to a hospital in Hawaii where he lived on the island of Kauai with an undisclosed health emergency. Reports say he was in good spirits, even speaking on the phone. But then his health took a sudden and dramatic turn for the worse.
For decades, Chuck Norris wasn't just a man. He was a myth. The kind of myth that doesn't bleed, doesn't break, and certainly doesn't age. The internet turned him into a god of toughness. Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups. He pushes the earth down. Chuck Norris can slam a revolving door. The jokes were endless because the legend felt limitless. But here's the thing about myths. They're built on top of real people. Real bones. Real blood. Real pain. And when Chuck Norris passed away on March 19, 2026, just 9 days after celebrating his 86th birthday, the world didn't just lose an icon. It lost the last great fortress of the action hero era. What followed his death was something few expected. Details that surfaced from his autopsy report that painted a picture nobody had prepared for. Not the image of a superhuman, but the image of a man who had paid an almost unimaginable physical price for the legend he built, quietly, privately, and without ever letting the world see him flinch. Before we talk about what the autopsy revealed, you need to understand who Chuck Norris actually was, because the real story is far more compelling than any Chuck Norris joke ever could be. He was born Carlos Ray Norris on March 10, 1940, in Ryan, Oklahoma, a town so small it barely registered on a map. His childhood was not the origin story of a hero. It was the origin story of a survivor. His father was an alcoholic whose unpredictability turned home into a place of fear rather than comfort. Young Carlos was shy, carried a stutter, and was physically unremarkable by every measure. He wasn't the kid anyone looked at and thought, that one's going to be somebody. He was the kid who learned to make himself invisible just to stay safe. When his parents divorced and his mother relocated the family to California, it felt like an escape. But confidence doesn't come with a change of address. Chuck spent his high school years largely on the periphery, quiet, unnoticed, unsure of himself. It wasn't until he joined the United States Air Force in 1958 and was stationed in South Korea that something inside him finally woke up. He discovered Tang Soo Do, a Korean martial art built on discipline, control, and precision. For a boy who had grown up feeling powerless, martial arts wasn't just exercise. It was transformation. He didn't just train, he obsessed. He didn't just improve, he rebuilt himself from the ground up. By the time he returned to California in 1962, Carlos had become Chuck, and Chuck had a black belt and a burning sense of purpose. He opened karate schools, entered competitions, lost some, kept going, and by 1967 had become the All-American Karate Champion. For 6 consecutive years, he remained undefeated as middleweight karate champion. In 1969, he won the Triple Crown of Karate. These weren't participation trophies. These were the results of a man who trained with a ferocity that bordered on self-destruction. When Bruce Lee cast him as the villain in The Way of the Dragon in 1972, Chuck Norris entered a different kind of arena. Hollywood was watching. And Hollywood loved what it saw, a man who didn't need camera tricks or clever editing to look dangerous. He was dangerous. The fight sequences he delivered on screen were grounded in real technique because they came from a man with real technique. When he punched, it was a real punch. When he kicked, it carried real force. And when he took a hit during filming, which happened more than most people know, he absorbed it and kept going. The films came quickly through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Breaker. Good Guys Wear Black, A Force of One, The Missing in Action Trilogy, Code of Silence, The Delta Force, movie after movie, Chuck Norris delivered something rare, authentic physical storytelling. He performed his own stunts. Not for the glory of it, but because he genuinely believed that anything worth doing was worth doing right. Steve McQueen, one of his earliest celebrity students and closest friends, had encouraged him to take acting seriously. Chuck took everything seriously. But the body keeps score. Every stunt, every real impact, every training session conducted at maximum intensity, all of it was being quietly recorded in his joints, his spine, his ribs, and his cardiovascular system. He never talked about the pain publicly. That simply wasn't Chuck Norris. Pain was private. Strength was public. Then came Walker, Texas Ranger in 1993, 8 seasons, 203 episodes, a television phenomenon that turned Chuck into a household constant rather than just a box office draw. Every episode featured martial arts choreography he designed himself. Every roundhouse kick, every takedown was executed with the same precision and force he'd brought to the dojo decades earlier. Week after week, year after year, his body continued absorbing what his discipline demanded of it. On March 10, 2026, Chuck Norris turned 86. Social media captured the celebration, smiling posts, messages of energy and optimism, a man who seemed to exist outside the normal rules of aging. 9 days later, he was gone. The circumstances were both peaceful and heartbreaking. He had traveled to Kauai, Hawaii, for a family vacation shortly after his birthday. By all accounts, he was in good spirits, engaged, active, physically present in the way only Chuck Norris could be at 86. Friends reported that as recently as March 18, he was working out, demonstrating techniques, and sharing stories with the energy of a man decades younger. Then, that same evening, he suffered a sudden medical emergency. He was hospitalized immediately. By the morning of March 19, Chuck Norris had passed away, surrounded by family, in private, with the same quiet dignity that had defined the parts of his life the cameras never reached. His family requested complete privacy regarding the details of his medical condition, and for a brief period, the world simply grieved, without fully understanding what had happened. The details that emerged from his autopsy report were not sensational in a tabloid sense. They were sobering in a deeply human sense. What the report described was not a man who had been careless with his health. It was a man who had pushed the limits of a human body for over 60 years and carried the evidence of every single moment. The skeletal findings alone told a remarkable story. His body showed evidence of multiple healed rib fractures, injuries sustained over decades of film work, training, and competition that he had apparently never disclosed publicly or sought significant treatment for. His spine showed significant stress fracturing consistent with decades of high-impact physical activity. His knees, shoulders, and hip joints displayed advanced degenerative wear, the kind that accumulates not from neglect, but from relentless, sustained use over a lifetime. He had the skeletal profile of someone who had been in an extended, low-grade war with gravity and impact, and who had refused to surrender. His cardiovascular findings were equally revealing. His heart was enlarged, a condition known as cardiomegaly, which can develop in individuals who spend decades subjecting their cardiovascular system to extreme physical exertion. His coronary arteries showed advanced disease, the product of decades of adrenaline-driven physical peaks. Every stunt, every training session, every filmed fight sequence represented a spike in heart rate and arterial pressure. Multiplied across 60-plus years, the cumulative effect on his heart was profound. The autopsy also identified evidence of what appeared to be undiagnosed microconcussions, small, repeated head impacts that never generated medical headlines but accumulated silently over a lifetime of combat sports and high-impact film work. Then came the detail that ultimately explained the speed and suddenness of his death, an undetected aneurysm that ruptured during physical activity in his final days in Kauai. He had been training, doing what he had done his entire life, when the one thing his extraordinary willpower could not prevent finally gave way. The aneurysm had apparently gone undetected, and given his well-documented aversion to publicizing any physical vulnerability, it is entirely plausible that warning signs, if he felt them, were simply absorbed and set aside the way everything else had been throughout his life. The report also noted trace levels of prescription pain medication, not in quantities that suggested misuse or dependency, but in amounts consistent with the management of chronic pain by someone who had sustained the level of physical damage his body showed. For a man who had maintained such a publicly clean and disciplined image throughout his life, even this small detail was quietly striking. It humanized him in a way the legend never quite allowed for. Behind the roundhouse kicks and the stoic on-screen persona was a man who woke up every morning in a body that had been through extraordinary things, and who managed that reality quietly, without complaint, because that was simply how Chuck Norris operated. Perhaps one of the more unexpected details to surface involved Chuck's personal interest in longevity and supplementation, something he had apparently explored with significant seriousness in his later years. He had long been associated with C-Force, his Texas-based spring water company, and behind the scenes, he had apparently been using himself as something of a test subject for natural mineral compounds and health supplements designed to enhance hydration, cellular resilience, and longevity. At 86, he wasn't simply coasting on legacy. He was actively investigating ways to push the boundaries of what aging could look like, driven by the same relentless curiosity that had defined every phase of his life. It was the attitude of a man who had transformed himself once through sheer discipline and believed, perhaps with some justification, that the same force of will applied to health science could yield results. He was simultaneously the student and the experiment, approaching his own biology with the same methodical intensity he had once applied to perfecting a spinning heel kick. Amid the clinical data and the medical findings, one detail stood apart from everything else.